My name is Alaina Randolph, and today I'm going to be talking about the Colonial Pipeline Ransomware attack. The Colonial Pipeline supplies gasoline and jet fuel to most of the East Coast. On May 6, 2021, the Colonial Pipeline experienced a ransomware attack. Nearly 100 gigabytes of data were stolen, and many of their machines were encrypted. The gasoline supply was disrupted as workers shut down the pipeline while they ensured that no machines controlling the pipeline itself had been compromised. The attacker group responsible, DarkSide, disbanded under pressure a few weeks later. This pressure included public pressure and pressure from corporations, as well as potentially pressure from the United States government. So, some background. What is ransomware? Ransomware is a type of malicious software, and it's usually used to gain profit. Ransomware works by encrypting a victim's files. The attacker then demands a ransom from the victim in order to unencrypt their files. A commonly used technique called double extortion is where ransomware steals some data from the victim before encrypting the victim's files. This means that even if the victim doesn't need to pay for decryption of their files, they still need to pay the ransom because otherwise the attacker may release their data on the internet or use it in some other nefarious way. What is DarkSide? DarkSide was a ransomware-focused hacking group that was founded in August of 2020. DarkSide provided ransomware as a service, meaning that other attackers or attacker groups could hire them to use their ransomware software on a victim. DarkSide was based in Russia but had no connection to the Russian government, according to statements from the US government. DarkSide claimed to be only profit-motivated, and they said they didn't want to do substantial damage or cause chaos. They kept a list of organizations safe from attack, including organizations which worked in medicine, funeral services, education, or were non-profit or in the government sector. Part of this may have been from their own principles, but also to keep attention low so that they would be under less pressure from both public and private sources. Why does this attack matter? Why should we study this attack? The Colonial Pipeline was a relatively sensitive target in that whenever its operations were closed down, it resulted in widespread fear and some panic as to what would happen next. As it turned out, this outage was only for a few days, but if a group had attacked which had been focused on causing damage, they might have been able to infiltrate the pipeline itself and to cause a longer outage or even worse occurrences. Disruptions of expected services are not good for people, for the companies, for anyone. So if we learn how this attack happened and what we could do to prevent another attack like this in the future, it can help all of us. Systems intrusion. How did the attack happen? The original start of the attack was with a single VPN account. This account should actually have been removed several months prior, as the employee was no longer working on that section and no longer needed a VPN account. The password was later discovered to have been released on the dark web as part of a separate breach not of Colonial Pipeline. This means that the password was likely reused, and this is how DarkSide was able to access the VPN account. There was no multi-factor authentication on the account. All they needed was a username and password. The exact details of how they matched the username and password are unknown, but was probably some detail in the passwords released on the dark web. Setting up for the ransomware launch. After gaining access through the VPN, DarkSide likely used some version of the code that will be shown ahead. This is code taken from another attack from DarkSide in which they use most likely the same or very similar code that they used for the Colonial Pipeline attack. This code relies on two vulnerabilities, CVE 2019-5544 and CVE 2020-3992. These two vulnerabilities had widely available patches at the time, but DarkSide targeted those organizations which had not yet patched their machines. Both these vulnerabilities allow code to be executed remotely using a port on some servers. The launch of the ransomware itself. First, the ransomware code runs an enumeration. It looks for the server that it's on, the servers nearby, and what kind of server it's running on. Then it uses escalation techniques to increase the amount of privilege it has or move to another account laterally that it can use to gain privilege. Once it has permissions, the code then deletes shadow volumes and removes defenses. This keeps the target organization from being able to use backups in the form of shadow volumes, and it also keeps the machine from being able to stop the ransomware attack. On the right, we can see an example of the Windows PowerShell scripts which find and delete the shadow volumes. These PowerShell scripts are called by the lower level code that the ransomware uses. Here is an example of the code that executes the ransomware. The code itself is encrypted and uses encrypted APIs and file storages and encrypts the messages that it will use so that it's not detected before the ransomware attack has taken place. Once everything is encrypted, the victim is notified of the attack. Here, DarkSide makes its initial demands for the ransom it wants the victim to pay. An example of the attack screen during a real attack in January 2021 is shown on the right. Here, DarkSide was demanding $30 million and was threatening to increase that price to $60 million if a certain amount of time passed. Negotiations. At this point, DarkSide establishes a sort of trust with their victim. They ensure the victim that if the ransom is not paid, that they will not be given decryption and that their information will be published online. They also assure the victim that if the ransom is paid and their demands are met, that they will decrypt the files. In this stage, it is possible for the victim to negotiate the ransom, in some cases by a considerable amount, up to 2/3 or more. Double extortion is used here because even if the company doesn't need their files decrypted, DarkSide is threatening to release their data. So, as it turns out, the Colonial Pipeline did pay the ransom. So the consequences of the attack overall were that Colonial Pipeline had to pay the ransom. There were gas shortages due to the shutting down of the pipeline for a temporary time, and there was government involvement in the attack. Colonial Pipeline ended up paying about $4.4 million in Bitcoin to DarkSide. The Department of Justice came in and went after the Bitcoin wallet of the attackers and managed to recover most of the Bitcoin. However, due to the volatility of the Bitcoin currency, when it was recovered, it was only worth $2.4 million. Gas shortages. Panic drove some shortages because there was enough gas for those 5 days, but people heard about the attack and became very frightened and went out to buy gas to ensure that they would have enough. This created an artificial shortage. Airlines were affected by the lack of jet fuel, which means that some flights were delayed or even canceled. After 5 days, the pipeline resumed delivery, but there were several scares in the coming months where people would go out and buy more gas than needed and create many shortages due to fear created from this shortage. Government involvement. There was increased pressure to address the issue of hackers from outside the United States after this event. One of those pressures was an anti-cybercrime report sent to the Biden administration from Colonial Pipeline and several other organizations. The Department of Justice, as we have seen, seized part of the ransomware money in an attempt to help Colonial Pipeline recover from the incident. So, in conclusion, the Colonial Pipeline attack resolved quickly, but future attacks could be worse. We need more protections in place for our sensitive infrastructure. And we also need to ensure that this infrastructure is protected with basic cybersecurity hygiene. The Colonial Pipeline was compromised because of a VPN password that had been released. The account was left open, the machines were not patched, and no multi-factor authentication was used. Potentially, if even one of these things had been prevented, the attack would not have happened. We need to ensure going forward that organizations put pressure on their employees, on themselves, to have good cybersecurity hygiene and prevent these attacks from happening. And lastly, here are my citations. Thank you. Questions. What are some of the most important steps companies with sensitive information or services can take to actually protect us, the consumers, and themselves? Many students in this class will go on to work in tech at various companies. What actions can we, as individual workers, bosses, or consultants, take to help ensure that the companies we work for are able to protect their users' data and protect the services that they provide?